Hey everybody, what is up? It's the Tominator here. Alright, so I've already done lists of the most aesthetic bodybuilders, the most genetically gifted, and the top 10 best bodybuilders in history, but now it's time to show some love to the freaks. So let's count down the top 10 freakiest mass monsters the sport of bodybuilding has ever seen. Now, keep in mind, this list features only high-level professional bodybuilders who competed at the Mr. Olympia, so don't expect to see any of these synthol freaks with the 27-inch oil-filled arms or any of that silly circus show crap. No, we're talking strictly about real IFBB bodybuilders here. And furthermore, these are some of the very best of the best, so like I said, if they didn't compete at the Mr. Olympia, they didn't make the cut. So that means no Zach Kahn, no Victor Richards, no Morgan Aste, nor even the gigantic Greg Kovacs, who was famous for being one of the tallest and heaviest bodybuilders of all time. Because even though he did compete professionally a handful of times in the IFBB, he never did so at the Olympia level. So with that said, let me just briefly go over a couple of honorable mentions before we get started. First up is the Golden Era icon Lou Ferrigno, one of the original mass monsters from back in the day, and a man who outmuscled even the legendary Arnold Schwarzenegger, who himself was one of the biggest bodybuilders of his era. Standing at an imposing height of 6'5", Ferrigno truly was the incredible Hulk of his time, but as we all know, times change and standards evolve, and what might have once been considered the biggest mass monster ever is relatively normal, even lean by today's standards. Gunter Schlierkamp falls into a similar boat as a taller bodybuilder at 6'1", and weighing up to a whopping 300 pounds on stage. Gunter even managed to outmass the mighty Ronnie Coleman on a couple of notable occasions, namely at the 2002 Mr. Olympia, where he had to settle for a highly contentious 5th place finish, and then afterwards here at the 2002 GNC Show of Strength, where he enacted his revenge and defeated the reigning Mr. Olympia by bringing even greater size and definition. It should go without saying, but when we're talking about Big Ron, that is no small feat. But again, relative to his tall stature, Gunter really didn't look all that massive, as many shorter bodybuilders of his generation were more thickly built and brought a bigger freak factor. Okay, so on to the list. Coming in at number 10 is Dennis James. Dennis was one of the biggest, most impressive-looking mass monsters of the 2000s. He was almost like the second coming of Nasser Al-Somebody in terms of thickness and just overall massive development, but unfortunately he was also lacking the necessary conditioning and detail, especially from the back, to succeed at the highest levels. The reason Dennis is placed so low on the list is because even though his monstrous physique looked positively Sandow-worthy in the gym, this never quite translated to the stage, unfortunately. He always tended to look noticeably smoother and flatter come contest day compared to his mind-blowing training pictures, so that's why Dennis the Menace James sits at number 10. At number 9 is Nasser Al-Somebody. Nasser was big and wide as a house, man, and standing at 5'11" and 270 plus pounds in contest shape, he could outmuscle just about anyone in the 90s. He also boasted some of the biggest shoulders, biceps, quads, and calves of his time, and at his best, he surely deserved that 1997 Mr. Olympia title against an injury-plagued Dorian Yates. The only thing holding Nasser back was, no pun intended, his back. He tended to hold a lot of water in this region, and this really hurt the overall impact of his physique, not to mention his placings. Nasser's contemporary Paul Dillette comes in at number 8. The man they called Freakenstein and Jurassic Paul was truly a giant of a bodybuilder, and he probably had the craziest proportions of all time when you consider just how massive he was at a height of 6'1", but with long, full muscle bellies more reminiscent of a 5'10" Flex Wheeler or even a 5'4" Lee Priest. So needless to say, Dillette was truly genetically gifted. Plus, he had an admirably tiny waist, probably the smallest of anyone on this list, which enabled him to pull off rare and highly difficult poses like the crucifix here. Dillette also boasted some gnarly vascularity through the upper pecs, which added to his freak factor. The main reason he's not any higher is twofold. Number 1, he was surprisingly weak from the back. His rear lat spread and back double biceps were totally underwhelming, and this brings us to point number 2, which is of course that the man couldn't pose to save his life. His inability to effectively hold a pose for even 2 seconds without shaking like a leaf in the wind really hurt his presentation, needless to say, and ultimately probably cost him a couple of spots on this list. Jay Cutler comes in at number 7. Now, Jay is unquestionably one of the biggest bodybuilders of all time, and as a former 4-time Mr. Olympia, you might expect to see him a little higher. But the reason he lands here is because, despite his massive size and frame, He really wasn't all that freaky. He was notoriously lacking in vascularity and didn't really have any freaky body parts aside from his boulder-sized deltoids and feathered quadriceps. He was relatively shapely for a mass monster as well, so the point is that Jay Cutler was simply too balanced and proportionate to be considered a true freak, in my opinion. But still, his raw size and extraordinary width are enough to ensure his inclusion. At number 6 is the man they call the Shadow, Dorian Yates. Now, despite what these famous larger-than-life black and white photo shoot pics might have you believe, Dorian actually wasn't the biggest guy on this list, far from it, but he was undoubtedly one of the freakiest. His back, calves, and forearms are all standout body parts for him and some of the best ever, plus he was known for having arguably the most razor-sharp Christmas tree of all time. His trademark combination of mass and ripped granite-like conditioning definitely warrants his spot on this list. He also gets bonus points for being the first to really usher in the mass monster era, which unofficially began when he shocked the world in 1993 by coming in bigger and better than ever before. So Dorian was the first modern mass monster, and for that reason, even though some of these other bodybuilders technically carried more muscle, Dorian places ahead of him. Next we have Rolly Winkler at number 5, and even though Rolly is the shortest bodybuilder on this list, standing at only 5'6" or so, that just makes his massive stature all the more impressive. Rolly has easily some of the biggest arms and shoulders in the business. His triceps are probably the best of all time, and the forearms and biceps aren't far behind. His back as well is wide as a barn door and almost tumorous looking through the lats, which lends him even more of a freak factor, as do his trademark grimaces. Every time he holds a pose, he looks like he's struggling to squeeze out a mighty shit. Plus, Rolly gets some definite props for sporting one of the most insane, most muscular poses of all time, which is a big part of why I rank him so highly here. After all, this is a pose that is tailor-made for the modern-day mass monster, so if you can nail this one, you are a true mass monster freak. And Rolly's fellow competitor Big Ramy lands at number 4. Potentially the biggest bodybuilder in history based on his height-to-weight ratio, Big Ramy is an absolute behemoth and well-deserving of his nickname. He is one of the only bodybuilders to ever step foot on stage in excess of 300 pounds, and in all likelihood he lays claim to the largest pair of thighs in history as well, measuring an astounding 36 inches. But what's nearly as remarkable is that his arms, chest, and back are likewise extremely massive and well-proportioned. Structurally, Ramy is perhaps the very best on this list. With his tiny waistline, flaring quads and lats, and the broad shoulders, his X-frame is practically peerless. Plus, he may very well have the most raw upper body width, rivaled only by that of Jay Cutler and one other bodybuilder we have yet to see. Honestly, if Ramy just had a little more detail and grainy conditioning, especially through the back, he could probably find himself at number 1 here. But aside from his quads, he is surprisingly balanced, just like Cutler, and doesn't have many standout freaky body parts or poses to speak of, his front lat spread being his strongest mandatory shot in my opinion. So, coming in at number 3 is none other than the Predator Kai Greene. Now, Kai might not be the biggest bodybuilder ever. Like Rolly Winkler, he is relatively short at only 5'8", but just like Rolly, his lack of height hasn't stopped him from attaining premium mass monster status, because Kai has packed so much muscle onto his frame, it's nothing short of miraculous. But the main reason I rank Kai so high is for his freakiness. He has some of the craziest peaked biceps and the lowest, thickest, most striated lats you'll ever see. Not to mention the massive feathered quads and the diced glutes and hamstrings, which rank among the best of all time as well. And let's not forget that Kai further differentiates himself from the pack with his unorthodox posing style, which includes donning some rather bizarre and garish costumes during guest posing appearances, so there's no question in my mind that Kai Greene is a freak of the highest order. Number 2 is Ronnie Coleman. Now, Ronnie in his prime was kind of like an even bigger and better version of Kai, if you ask me. Well, it's true that earlier in his career, in the 1990s, he was leaner and more athletic-looking, and in certain years he was almost on the small side, like in 2001 and 2002, but at his heaviest and most dominant, as he was in 2003 and 2004, when he weighed in at an alleged 287 and 296 pounds, respectively. He was the mass monster to end all mass monsters. I still maintain that nobody to this very day, and I repeat, nobody could defeat his 2003 version, which brought this incomparable combination of mass and shredded conditioning. Big Ramy and Jay Cutler simply don't have the detail or sheer development to hang with him from the back, and guys like Phil Heath and even Dorian Yates lack Big Ron's overwhelming size. And again, just like Kai Greene, Ronnie had several freaky world-class features, namely his biceps, his glutes, hams, and back. Though at his biggest, even his chest, shoulders, and thighs were some of the most massive and awe-inspiring the world has ever seen. So yeah, you might be wondering, who could possibly top Ronnie Coleman as the biggest mass monster freak in bodybuilding history? Well, my friends, in case you haven't guessed it already, and by now you probably should have, I present to you the German giant Markus Rühl. Now, first and foremost, it needs to be said that Rühl was in no way, shape, or form the best or most accomplished bodybuilder on this list. That's not what it's about. He surely doesn't compare to multiple-time Olympia winners like Dorian, Yates, Jay Cutler, or Ronnie Coleman. But when it comes to that undeniable freak factor, there is simply no one better than Markus Rühl. He was truly a mass monster like no other because he brought nearly unparalleled size with a freaky, blocky shape. In no way can you label this man aesthetic, but at the same time, it's hard to not be impressed by his alien-like physique. Rühl had veritable boulders for shoulders, mountains for biceps, a split chest so thick you'd think it was two distinct muscle groups, and one of the widest frames and backs of all time. He definitely wasn't the most balanced. His triceps were severely undersized compared to his massive biceps, and his shape and proportions, as already mentioned, were far from aesthetically pleasing, but this only added to his freak factor appeal. At a height of 5'11" and about 275 to 285 pounds on stage, it's not hyperbolic to say that Markus Rühl could outmuscle virtually anyone in human history, aside from perhaps Big Ramy. And finally, it has to be said that his shredded form at the 2002 Night of Champions is perhaps the single most freaky bodybuilding physique of all time, bar none. And that is why Markus Rühl tops my list of the biggest freaks in bodybuilding. So thanks for watching, everybody. Hope you enjoyed. Do you agree with this list? Did I miss anybody? Please let me know what you think in the comments below. And remember that here I was focusing only on highly accomplished Olympia-level bodybuilders. So once again, no synthol freaks or social media guys, okay? Alright, but that's all for this one. And until next time, I'm the Tominator signing off, and I'll be back.